All right, everyone, and it's 12 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. We have a great session planned today. I'm really excited. Welcome to our Northwest webinar for this month. My name is Meg Bruner, and I'm from the Northwest ATTC, and we'll be helping to moderate today's session. Next slide, please. Scott, can you hit to the, thank you. All right, a few housekeeping things before we get started. First, if you have any questions at any time during the session today, please go ahead and type them into the chat box. Our presenter, Scott, will be taking a few breaks to answer questions as he goes, and then there should be some time at the end as well. Next slide. After the session is over today, we'll be sending you an email that has the slides attached, a link to where you can find a recording of today's webinar, which will be posted tomorrow, and a link to our survey. Please take our survey. It's super short, and it really helps us make sure we're doing right by you folks, bringing you the topics and information that you need. Next slide. Finally, we'll be sending certificates of attendance out to folks who stay for the session today. Those usually take about a week or two for us to get out. You don't need to do anything to get your certificate because we have your email from your registration. If you're attending in a group, though, using a single registration link to share for access, please email us today with the names and email addresses for others in the group so we can send them a certificate as well. All right. Today's session is titled Getting Started with EBP Implementation, Exploration Matters, and it's brought to you by Scott Caldwell of the Wisconsin Department of Health Services. Scott has worked in the behavioral health treatment field for 3 decades as a provider, trainer, evaluator, and consultant, and also leads the Motivational Interviewing Implementation Project, which partners with selected provider organizations for a multi-year implementation process. Having recently completed the inaugural Implementation Practice Certificate Program through the Collaborative for Implementation Practice at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I can't believe I said all of that correctly. Scott is passionate about ongoing learning and collaboration with provider organizations to make EBP implementation a reality. So take it away, Scott.
Well, Meg, thank you so much for that mouthful. And thank you, Northwest ATTC, for inviting me here. I'm just thrilled to be here. And if there is one thing to take away from this webinar, everyone, it is this. The next time one of your colleagues or your supervisor comes to you and says, hey, can I sign you up for the upcoming EBP training? That is your cue to pause and to consider exploration matters. And I've got some modest learning objectives for the hour. Go ahead and take a look. I think the most important objective here is to consider interest in learning more. There is a lot to learn about exploration matters. And just for inspiration and just some practical ideas, interspersed in the webinar, I'm going to share a slide on examples from the field. And I hope that gets you thinking about some direction, some guidance for learning more about implementation matters. So let's get started with good news. There is a lot of good news here. And after decades of time and literally billions of dollars of investment from the federal government, from SAMHSA, for example, there are so many evidence-based practices and programs available for uptake and delivery by you all in the behavioral health treatment world. And we all know here that EBPs directly contribute to improving service outcomes. And one of the things that I've noticed in recent years as a consultant for implementation with provider organizations in the field is that this younger generation of practitioners entering the field are just so open and willing and eager to learn. And they just are so interested in their organizations investing in their professional growth and development. More good news. There is increasingly expertise and resources available to organizations that want to go down this path of EBP implementation. And I'm going to have Northwest ATTC in a little bit share some access to expertise that you can get right here within the region. And then I will have some resources for you as well. So what could possibly be the bad news here, folks? Well, there's a recent estimate that only 1 to 3% of provider organizations in the behavioral health treatment system are finding success with EBP implementation. So how to explain this? We've got all this good news, how to explain these low rates of implementation. And I have kind of a laundry list here, which I'm going to go through quickly, but the bottom line is that a lot of the barriers to implementation success can be traced back to implementation matters. So one of the things that I see in a lot of conversations with leaders and clinical supervisors and staff in the field is just a real lack of appreciation of what EBP implementation requires. And I like this formula for success from Dean Fixon and colleagues. These are implementation scientists. And if we kind of work backwards from benefits to clients as a result of an EBP being implemented, what we find are really three main factors. Factor number one is practitioners have to get good at the EBP. They have to deliver it as it is intended to be delivered. We all know that as fidelity. So that's the first factor. The second factor is that EBP, those new ways of working with the EBP have to be integrated into routine services. So with fidelity, integration into routine services. And the third factor is that the practitioners doing this learning and integration have to have their organization support through policies, through procedures, through infrastructure. And this is a multiplication formula, folks, because if any of these factors are low, then the benefits to clients will be suboptimal. Or think about any of these factors like not being in place at all or being like zero. Well, we all know that anything multiplied by zero is zero. There will not be any benefits to clients. So what is the bottom line here? With thinking about implementation, it's that it represents a highly ambitious project for any organization. So now some more barriers that I've seen as really pretty common practice among organizations is the single champion approach to implementation. Never been very effective. I'm going to come back to that as part of Exploration Matters. Train and hope. We know that standalone single one-shot training is important as a part of implementation, but it's never sufficient for promoting implementation success. And then when management's message is, okay, you got the training now, just do it, that kind of compounds the ineffectiveness. A couple more things, and this is kind of the dynamic between practitioners and their clinical supervisors, that when clinical supervisors rely on their staff to self-report, we know that's really riddled with a lot of problems. Practitioner self-report studies consistently show is not particularly reliable. When practitioners report what they're doing in sessions, evidence-based practice-wise, skills-wise, it doesn't really correlate with actual practice. And then a very recent study, very interesting recent study, Unpacking Clinical Supervision, found that clinical supervisors spent an inordinate amount of time on administrative tasks and functions, really kind of at the expense of that practitioner development, skill development, and even attention on specific EBPs. And, you know, the responsibility goes all the way to the top, that there's been a real lack of state system and supports and infrastructure and expertise and funding for implementation. So all these things contribute to a struggle to find success with implementation. But what I want to suggest here, folks, is that when exploration gets glossed over, when it gets missed, or when it just gets skipped entirely, that is a huge barrier to implementation success, because exploration really sets up the foundations for later success. And what you're looking at here is from the EPIS framework. EPIS is EPIS. It represents each unique stage of implementation. And implementation is a stage-based process. And for those of you who are familiar with the stages of change, think stages of change for organizations, where exploration is like the organization is contemplating, do we want to implement an EBP? And if so, which one? And let's gather some information to make an informed decision. So that's exploration. And if an organization decides, okay, we want to move forward with a particular EBP, then we're going to begin preparing. So what are those organizational supports and policies and procedures and infrastructure that we need to begin resourcing and getting into place? Let's get our clinical supervisors ready, the supervisors, practitioners following training. Let's get ready for fidelity reviews. Let's get ready for data, kind of putting together a data system to monitor fidelity that we can use for improvement. And then implementation, this is like the action stage of change, where the practitioners who are out of training and into clinical supervision, they're just beginning to deliver the new ways of working with fidelity, with the first program participants, with the first clients. And then getting to sustainment, the high bar here for being in that maintenance stage is that 50% of all your participants in that particular program are now receiving the evidence-based practice. So for our purposes here today, folks, what we're going to do is really dig into Exploration Matters, this information gathering process. And I want to suggest there are 4 crucial foundations. And our learning objective is for you to be able to identify 2 of these foundations. So if you are a leader in the webinar here or later on in the recording, pay attention to the leadership foundation. And in fact, leaders, we're going to invite you to post a question into chat in this first part on the foundation of leadership for exploration. Or maybe you're a team player. You're going to really pay attention to the team approach as a foundation for exploration. Or maybe you're like, you love the details, you're really analytical in your approach to the work, and so you're going to pay attention to information gathering. That's going to be the foundation of exploration that's going to really kind of get you excited. But then we all want to pay attention to the foundation of attending to staff readiness. So we're going to take each one of these foundations one at a time, and we're going to start with leadership. And it's always useful to start with the why. And so what I'd like to do is launch a poll, and whether you are an authorized leader or you are an opinion leader, you are a peer leader, hey, you are in this webinar. So that makes you a leader in the field right there, thinking about Exploration Matters. I want you to go to the poll and identify your top 2 reasons why implementation is important. So we're launching the poll. We'll give you a minute to identify your top 2 reasons. Okay, responses are coming in. Keep them coming, everyone. We're almost at 50%. Keep them coming. Oh, we just crossed 70%. So keep them coming. We'll close the poll in 10 seconds, finalize your poll response, and then we'll take a look at the results in 10 seconds. Okay, thank you, everyone. We're going to close the poll at, oh, we just got to 78%. And here are the results. Starting with the why. Oh my gosh, yes, more effective services with selecting an evidence-based practice for implementation. And yes, so we got a nice tie here. Our top most voted reasons are better client outcomes and satisfaction with services. And then I love the more cohesive teams, folks. Yes, because when you're working on an evidence-based practice in your team, you have shared concepts, you have shared language, elements of practice. So love all of those reasons. And that's the starting point for leaders, is to have these reasons. Go to your leadership team and have those reasons. So here's another foundation for leadership, and that is being ready to make some important decisions in the exploration process. And I love this rubric of good, fast, and cheap, because it's very simple. I've never met a leader who did not want an implementation project to be good, fast, and cheap. But guess what? You only get to pick two. And so let's just kind of walk through this. If you were like, well, I want the project to be fast and cheap, well, it will not be good. Never has been, never will be. If you want a good quality project, so you're not going to skimp on quality, and you want it fast, it is not going to be cheap. And so what does that mean? That means that you're probably going to have to outsource the heavy lift of coaching, of fidelity reviews, of performance-based feedback to your providers who are participating in the project, collecting that fidelity data, managing that data, using it to improve your organizational supports and processes and things like that. And that can happen pretty quickly when you outsource that, but it's just not going to be cheap at all to hire a consulting group to come in and do that heavy lift. And so where I tend to occupy this decision rubric are with leaders who, again, are not going to skimp on the quality. They want a good quality implementation project, but it's got to be fairly cheap. And so guess what? It is not going to be fast. And that brings us around to kind of our first example from the field. And it's what I like to call implementation on the cheap. And in my work with organizations, I do not come with a budget. I do not come with funds. We do implementation on the cheap. And so get ready, leaders, for about a 5-year process. And one of the things that I've noticed in the field is that provider organizations often have so many more resources right underneath their nose that are existing that can be allocated or repurposed toward a good quality implementation project. And here's the biggest takeaway from implementation on the cheap, and that is the single biggest resource is going to be time. Time is money in that sense. And what do I mean by time? Well, it is going to be time for the implementation team to be meeting regularly and to be engaging in those stage-based tasks in between meetings. Time is required for practitioners to be learning new ways of working in that evidence-based practice. Supervisors need time for their own learning, but also to provide coaching. Because you're not outsourcing the coaching and the fidelity reviews, that's going to take time internally for your supervisors. So time has to be protected for a good quality project. That's really the big takeaway here. Another element of leadership as a foundation for exploration is we got to get beyond just do it. And very interesting study of 376 organizations. This is in the private sector, and the researchers did kind of an archival research methodology with looking at these private sector organizations' approach to innovation. And they kind of coded the archival data for 3 different approaches. And then they looked at outcomes 2 years after the innovation was launched. And this leader edict approach, the just do it approach, really netted about 1/3 of percent of rate of implementation success. And there was a little bit of a bump in implementation success with leader persuasion, so kind of having that why of EBP implementation, but it was the wisdom of leaders to create an implementation team. The implementation team approach drove the single best outcomes of innovation at 2 years. And so this is another element of leadership for exploration is leaders empower a team. Empower a team to do the work of exploration. Consider a consultant, consider a technology transfer specialist. And I would love for the Northwest ATTC folks, Meg, if you're able to put into chat a way that people here in the webinar can get in touch with one of the Northwest ATTC addiction technology transfer specialists for this is a free service for consulting on, hey, how do I get started with EBP in this exploration process that I learned all about with Scott in this webinar. So leaders, you get to look into the resources that are out there and available, like right through the ATTCs. And then humility. Fascinating study that I have in the references by Greg Ahrens and colleagues called The Humble Leader. And it linked leadership humility with really highly successful rates of implementation. And I think humility is particularly important when we're in the exploration process, because humility is like not having all the answers, like deferring to your team to figure out some things in exploration, to do that information gathering and an analysis. Humility by leaders means being curious. What are our options? What are the existing resources? Not ruling anything out. So that humility is just a real important part, I think, especially during exploration. So leaders, and I really see everyone here as a leader. So leaders is very inclusive. Would love to hear your initial thoughts or questions so far. And feel free to go to chat for that. And we can pause here and take a couple of those questions. Or we can also pause at a different point in the hour if there aren't any questions inspired quite yet. And I'm not seeing any questions in the chat unless, Meg, you are privy to something that I'm not aware of.
Nope, I'm not seeing anything either.
Okay, so everyone consider a question as we go, and maybe we will handle those towards the end. And now let's just kind of keep on going here with the team approach, the second foundation to exploration matters. And so, you know, that single champion approach, the single champions that approach me are always so well-intentioned. They're passionate, they're smart, they're go-getters, they're agents of change, and they're rarely effective because they're just trying to just do it solo. And so the team approach is much more effective because the team shares the work. We're not going to put the burden on one single champion. Now, that champion could be part of the team, absolutely. But we're going to bring in multiple perspectives on exploration, which is really important because as you're gathering information, you need to make sense of that information. You need to interpret that information. And so having multiple perspectives at the table is really important. And then that is going to make stronger shared decision-making, because ultimately, exploration is about making decisions. Do we want to move forward with what evidence-based practice? And so having that team approach is going to make for really sound shared decision-making. And guess what? The science aligns with this as well. And in fact, the science is so strong about implementation teams that it really has become a critical resource for provider organization success. And so I was kind of blown away when I saw this study because, you know, we've heard about this kind of 17 years it takes to achieve implementation of innovations when they just kind of diffuse slowly into practice, kind of hoping EBP happens. But when an implementation team is in place, the calculus is completely changed. I mean, we're talking about 3 years with an 80% success rate. This is just phenomenal. So there's something very powerful about an implementation team and forming one of those teams in the exploration stage is really important. So here is another kind of inspiration from the field, an example from the field about how do you think about forming a team? How do you go about that? And so here's an example that I run into, and this is a recent example where a program director reached out to me, the consultant, for guidance on implementation. And we started with the why, and that led to this director saying, okay, I want to form a team. And so we had an agreement. We're going to form a team and we're going to work together for a designated period of time. It ended up being about 4 months. And we're going to explore 2 evidence-based practices for possible implementation. And I can tell you what those practices are. The practices were motivational interviewing, and the other practice was dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. And so those were the 2 practices that staff were really, really excited about. There were champions on both sides. And we met with a membership of that director, a clinical supervisor, a data specialist, kind of a quality improvement, quality assurance person from the organization. We had a practitioner, so a provider doing direct services. We had a service participant, a client of services, and then myself as the consultant. So you can see in that team membership, we had just such an incredible representation of diverse perspectives. And then as the consultant, I facilitated a little initial learning about what it means to be an implementation team, what it means to be in this exploration stage, and what some of the initial steps of exploration were. And so the next example from the field, folks, I will take this example and kind of move it forward about what we actually did. So I'll leave you with a little bit of suspense here about what happened after we formed this team. So final thing on the team approach here, folks, is to begin some of these initial steps as a team with information gathering. Information gathering is the heart of exploration. It's like contemplation. And to do that, you have to gather information. And I'm going to share with you 2 amazing tools that are publicly available for your information gathering. So let's get to it. Third foundation here, using the initiative inventory. And I'll tell you what, before I go to that, Meg, is there any questions so far?
Yes, we have one question, and here it is.
Okay.
If there are multiple EBPs to implement, how do you prioritize?
Oh, I love that question because this is part of the information gathering process. So whoever asked that question, you are absolutely going to love the response here. So let me first talk about the initiative inventory, and then we're going to get to head-to-head decision-making on EBPs in the Hexagon tool. So let's start with the initiative inventory. I've had a couple of leaders with their teams do this, and it is such a revelation. They're like, oh my gosh, this initiative inventory was so useful for just laying out, what do we have currently going on? What are our mandates? What are our commitments of resources and financial commitments? And then this inventory with some details really sets up consideration about how a potential EBP implementation project might fit or really might not fit. We're spread too thin. This is not a good time. This initiative inventory developed by the team can really provide the organization some important insights into whether to move forward or not. This is right from the National Implementation Research Network, and I've got this in the reference section as a link. The other tool, and this is the key tool, folks, for exploration, and is the Hexagon tool. And so as Hexagon implies, there are 6 domains that a team goes about gathering very important, detailed information about a potential EBP. And so let me kind of briefly describe these 6 domains, and then I'm going to launch another poll to kind of get your all sense for which domains you think might get kind of like the most attention in an exploration process, which ones kind of might be the easiest to gather information on, and which ones might be a little bit more challenging to gather information on. So stay tuned for that poll. The first three are specific to an evidence-based practice. These are indicators of what the heck is the evidence of this EBP, the evidence of effectiveness with your population that you're providing services to, the evidence of effectiveness within the service setting that those services are being provided in. The next one is usability. How usable is this evidence-based practice? Is it kind of off the shelf with clearly defined components and elements of practice that are measurable? We've got kind of fidelity assessments that's attached to it. That would be kind of like a pretty usable EBP right off the shelf. Or maybe it's more ambiguous. Maybe we don't have fidelity measures. So usability is an important domain to gather information on. And then supports. Is there a consultant available? What kind of training can we get? What kind of coaching can we get? What kind of fidelity review supports can we get? What kind of supports can we get for a data system to kind of monitor the implementation project? Now, these three domains are juxtaposed by implementation site indicators. These are indicators that are specific to your unique organization. And it kind of starts with the need. Like, what is the need of our program participants that we seek to address with an evidence-based practice, with an innovation? And what kind of fit are we going to have with this particular EBP, with our organization's values, our mission, our initiatives, initiative inventory, with things that we already have going on, our philosophy, our fit with our practitioner readiness, and all those sorts of things. And then finally, kind of the rubber meets the road with capacity. What is our capacity to implement this evidence-based practice? Given the costs of it, given the use of technology that might be required, given the use of other things that are required for implementation. So anyway, the team gathers detailed information on these 6 domains. And here are just some example questions. This is right from the tool. Again, this tool is public domain. I've got a link to it. This tool comes from the National Implementation Research Network. So just take a moment to take a look at these example questions. And then I'm going to launch the poll about which domain, which set of questions do you think would be like kind of the most easiest to gather information on? And which questions are kind of tricky, kind of pose a challenge. So take a look and then we'll launch the poll. And I just want to point out here, folks, on the need. That the focus population, what are the needs of the focus population? And how do members of the focus population perceive their needs and what might be helpful? That's why having clients at the exploration table is so important, because you can't really get at those questions without your program participants. So let's go ahead and launch the poll on information gathering. And go ahead and take a moment here to consider, of these 6 domains, on which domain do you think might be the easiest to gather information? And on which domain do you believe might be the most challenging to gather information? Yeah, keep the responses coming. We're at 30%. Keep them coming. We just cracked 50%. Keep them coming. We'll go another 20 seconds. Okay, finalize your votes, and then we'll close the poll, take a look at the results. Okay. And survey says, so on which domain we thought might be the easiest, it looks like need is kind of the top voted domain. And that really makes sense because it's like, you know your population, you know the issues, and you can pretty readily line up how an evidence-based practice is going to address those issues. And then evidence as well. And yeah, because there's a lot of research out there on different EBPs. So very, very nice, folks. Now let's go to the challenges. And it's really fascinating looking at these results. It's really kind of equal opportunity for the challenges across the domains. And it looks like gathering information about the supports kind of is identified as the top rated domain for challenge. And that kind of makes sense as well, because when we think about supports, like you really have to have access to an expert. You've got to have some pretty detailed information about what, if you were to take on an EBP, what comes with it. And that's going to require digging into some details. So thank you, everyone, for some really nice insights into these domains, what's easier to gather and what might be a little more challenging. So now let's go to the question on how do you discern one EBP from the next? And so what I have reproduced for you on the left-hand panel is right from the tool itself. You can see the 6 domains and some of the kind of the main areas of exploration. And then what you see reproduced on the right is literally taking 1 or 2 or up to 3 EBPs and looking at them by domain head to head. And so based on the information that the team is gathering and the data that you're collecting, specific to need and evidence and fit and everything else, the team will score each domain on a 1 to 5 scale. So 1 is it's not at all going to meet need, or the evidence is not at all there, or the fit is not at all there, up to a 5, where it's like, yes, this EBP is very strongly going to meet need with very strong evidence and excellent goodness of fit. So what we have here is a range of 6 on the very low end of the scoring rubric up to 30. And so, example from the field, quick story, to just kind of circle back around from the cliffhanger, we formed that exploration team. And then the team actually used the hexagon tool to do an analysis. We met bi-weekly, 2 hours each meeting for 4 months. We gathered information systematically on motivational interviewing and dialectical behavioral therapy. As a consultant, I facilitated that team-based scoring using the hexagon tool. And here were our results. And you can see for motivational interviewing, we kind of had a result 26 out of a range of 6 out of 30. So pretty strong showing for motivational interviewing in the final analysis. And DBT certainly showed pretty well, but just 20. And you can see the different domains. Motivational interviewing was really strong on evidence, really strong on usability, whereas DBT had pretty good evidence, but kind of fell down on need and supports and capacity and fit as well. So it really took some of the champions for DBT by surprise in seeing this analysis. So the last foundation I want to touch on, and then we'll take a couple of the questions that have come into chat, is attending to staff readiness. Because the team can do the analysis, the team can come up with kind of the best EBP out of that analysis. So for the example from the field, it was motivational interviewing in that example. But now what? Well, what we need to do is we've got to pay attention to staff's readiness for change with the EBP that is being selected for implementation. And the reason why, folks, we have to pay attention to staff readiness is because we're not going to get very far unless we bring staff with us. So this is a critical foundation for later implementation success. Here are some best practices, and then I'll show you an example from the field. The leadership communicates the why of the EBP and of implementation. Results of the hexagon analysis are shared with staff. And this is a really neat thing, is putting together a listening session, a formal listening session with staff to really draw out what are their questions, what are their thoughts, what are their ideas based on this hexagon analysis, based on the initiative inventory, based on what the team's kind of final analysis is. What are their concerns about this particular EBP? What are their concerns about going down the road of implementation? And we want to normalize the ambivalence. Staff can very likely see both sides, the reasons for EBP implementation and the reasons against. So we want to normalize that and we want to draw it out, hopefully resolve it. And one way that we can resolve ambivalence, I think, is if you're moving forward, that is to invite staff to self-select so that you're going to get the first implementers who are not ambivalent. They are like, ooh, I really want to learn this EBP. And a couple of lessons learned here is for practitioners and staff to select into an EBP implementation project really requires truth in advertising. What are they signing up for? What are they getting themselves into? What are going to be the expectations? So it's not just what they're going to get from participation, but what is going to be expected of them. And what we found really the hard way is that obtaining prior approval from supervisor to participate is going to be really important, because we've had some folks who are really passionate about learning and evidence-based practice, but they're struggling to get their paperwork done. They're struggling to make entries. They're struggling to get their billing in order. And so those folks who struggle with some basic performance issues probably aren't the best to be among the first implementers. So last example from the field, we have formed a team, we have done the hexagon analysis, and now we are talking here about facilitating an all-staff meeting. And so what the team did for this all-staff meeting was briefly presented the hexagon analysis in a way that was very transparent and easy to understand. Then the team facilitated a listening session. We heard amazing things from staff. We heard their thoughts, their questions, their fears, their concerns about motivational interviewing as the selected EBP. And then the team facilitated an activity to kind of further explore readiness and specifically kind of what staff's perceived importance was for implementation. And we actually used a tool from motivational interviewing for this. And this is a tool that you could incorporate into any of your all staff meetings if you ever get to the point of exploration where you're putting this in front of staff. So some of you might find the importance ruler to be vaguely familiar. Tool from motivational interviewing. And so here's how we're actually going to use this in kind of our last activity here as we're going to start wrapping up after this. And what I'd like you to do is on this ruler where 0 is not at all important and 10 is very important, I'd like you to consider how important it is to you that your organization implements an EBP. And I want you to indicate your response anywhere 0 to 10 by placing a stamp. And I'm going to put it at the bottom, the instructions for how to place a stamp on this importance ruler. You go to the top of your screen, view options, select annotate, and then with annotate, a toolbar is going to pop up, and click on stamp, and that will allow you to place a stamp anywhere 0 to 10 to indicate your importance regarding your organization. So let's go ahead and take a couple minutes on this. Yes, and if you cannot annotate, then please put into chat your response 0 to 10. Okay, here it comes in chat. This is going to be a good way to do it. Keep them coming in chat if you'd like. Okay, lovely. Folks, thank you. So this is exactly what we did in that all staff meeting to kind of see where staff were at in their perceived importance for moving forward with implementation. And thank you for just kind of simulating that here with me. Okay. So to summarize here, we've covered a lot of ground. We've got 4 foundations for exploration. It starts with leadership, but it certainly does not end there. The team approach is highly effective to engage the stage-based steps and activities of exploration, which is all about information gathering. And I can tell, like through the poll, that and a couple of the questions in the chat, that there's some real interest in like, ooh, we can do this systematic information gathering to make an informed decision, and then attending to staff readiness. And so, Meg, I'm wondering about some questions that might be in the chat.
I don't see any questions at the moment.
Okay.
There was one earlier where someone was asking for the website name for the national EMP. Do they mean EBP? Did you mention a website earlier?
Gosh, yeah. I mean, there are so many EBPs that are out there.
Yeah.
In various registries and things like that. And so I'll just mention, and I can put it in the chat, it's the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices. As a, that's what the federal government maintains out of SAMHSA, but there are probably many other registries as well. So folks, we are going to be wrapping up in just a few minutes, and feel free to go to chat. And I apologize if I might have erased chat inadvertently, a question or two that was in there. if anybody would like to go back to chat with a question, we do have a few more minutes to handle that. And as you all are considering a possible question, the bottom line here for Exploration Matters is that you are going to come to a very clear, informed decision about implementing an EBP or not. Strategic abandonment. And yes, for outreach. Yes, if you could say a little bit more about outreach, Mark. But if outreach involves, I'm not. If you could clarify what you mean by outreach. Ah, yes, homeless outreach. Oh my gosh, there's evidence-based practice for highly effective homeless outreach. Yes. And it starts with exploration, find out what's out there. And with an area of services that don't have a lot of evidence-based practices, one of the things that the Hexagon tool gets your organization thinking about is, well, maybe this particular service approach to homeless outreach doesn't meet the high bar of evidence-based, but it's evidence-informed, or it has kind of a compilation of best practices embedded in it. And those can be useful as well. And the Hexagon tool, really kind of in the evidence domain, really handles all kinds of innovations that have different levels of evidence. So yes, the short answer is yes. Okay, so here's one last thing here. Well, here's the bottom line, and then we'll have one last activity in chat before we wrap up. Let's get to the bottom line here. That if you take the time in exploration, not glossing over, not missing it, not skipping it, it is going to save you and your organization time and money. And significantly so, folks. Because when you just send staff to training and you make that investment of time and money, and everyone comes back and they love the training, and then nothing changes, that is not a useful allocation of your precious limited resources. But when you take the time to explore, you're going to save money in the long run, and you're going to set your organization up for implementation success, whatever the implementation, whatever the innovation may be. Maybe it's not an evidence-based practice, to Mark's point about homeless outreach, but maybe it's an innovation that is going to improve your current service delivery approach. And that's the point here, is you want to engage in exploration process to figure out what innovation to pick up and to get into practice. And so getting started with EBP implementation, folks, here, I have created just for you all in this webinar and anybody who finds this in a future recorded, this checklist. And so you can find this posted to the webinar website. It basically takes each one of these foundations that we've covered, and it kind of puts real specific measurable steps where you can literally check the box of a completion status on these things. And so feel free to avail that to yourselves. And there's lots of links, but the Hexagon tool, the initiative inventory in here. Okay. So last thing before we wrap up, let's just say you've engaged this exploration process, you've completed the Hexagon analysis, you put the results in front of staff. Staff are pretty fired up and ready, and now you're moving forward with some kind of innovation or evidence-based practice in your organization. You've got a project Now what? I'd like everyone to go to chat. What would be your next step in chat? You're moving forward. The decision has been made. Now what? And this will close us out. Love it. Yes, we're going to delegate. We're going to get some roles and responsibilities going on this team. Yes, and we've gathered information. Maybe there's some more information to gather. Yes. Oh, I love that. We're actually going to begin supervision. We're going to prep our supervisors for actual implementation. Love that. Yes. Research, more information gathering. Yes. And what you all are kind of pointing to in the chat with these, just these very intuitive next steps is we're going from exploration. We've made the decision, and now we're moving into preparation, the next stage of implementation, the next stage of change. So folks, thank you so much for your engagement in here. Here is the list of references, and we would love for you to take 1 minute to complete that survey on how this webinar was. Thank you again, Northwest ATTC, for making all this happen.
Thank you so much, Scott. We really enjoyed having you here today. I feel like I learned a lot in just 1 hour, and it was really engaging and fun too. Really appreciate that. Thank you everyone for coming today and for taking our survey, and I'll include information in the email I send out later today with a link to that survey, and also a link to register for our next webinar, which will be on June 7th. And is called Centering Indigenous Knowledge, Culture, and Communities, Approaches to Indigenous Evaluation and Opioid Overdose Prevention Programming. We hope to see you there, and have a great rest of the day, everybody.